Greetings to everyone. This is our study group to study Spiritist psychology, and I would like to hand it over tonight to Lionel and Anahy for the talk for tonight. Over to you.
Thank you, Fabrizio. So I will first share a quick PowerPoint so we can take a first look at some concepts, and then I will give it back to actually hand over to Lionel. Okay, just share here the PowerPoint. Oh, let's see. Is that okay, Fabrizio?
Yes, yeah, that's all good.
Okay. So we all want to listen to Professor Corbett's ideas and reflections. So I kind of divided in two parts, okay? So today it's part 1. And we are going to be talking mostly about Jung's concepts and also Professor Corbett's reflections on the matter, okay? So remember that in some class I put this, can't even remember when I put this image in which class, but it's like, you know, the future expansion of consciousness and the inner, actually the inner child, the archetype of the divine child, all our potentialities to create, you know, the energy to create. But to get to this point, so we have to, you know, be in contact with what is still shadow, darkness in all of us, okay? And just for you all to remember, we have already seen, this is one of the images when we talk about Jung's map of the psyche. This is by Peter Freeman. So we have the ego in green and the persona. Okay, this is the outer layer is consciousness. So the ego is the center of consciousness. The persona and the shadow, we are going to see both of these complexes. They are related to the ego. And the shadow, as you can see here in brown, is in the personal unconscious, okay? And it's in the opposite, it makes an opposition with the persona that is in white, okay? And then here we have the self, and that Professor Lionel Corbett was talking about last class. And then we have the in yellow, the collective unconscious, the archetypal level of, and the objective psyche or objective psyche. So then light and shadow. Oops, sorry. So just fixing this. So the psyche consists of many parts and centers of consciousness, as we have already seen, okay? It does not constitute a unit, but a constellation in Jung's words, a constellation in which, besides the sun, there are other luminaries. The ego complex is not the only psychic complex. This is very different from psychoanalysis, for instance, okay? The concept, Jung's concept of the ego, as we have already seen, as a complex of you know, the self, of the bigger psyche. And this only the center of consciousness. So when the subpersonalities are in opposition, so the complex, talking about the complexes, as we have already seen in a previous class, so there's going to be conflicting attitudes and feelings, okay, from the ego point of view. And one of these conflicting pairs is the persona and the shadow. So shadow is the image of ourselves that sleeps in our wake as we walk towards the light, as Jung says. Jung says that the shadow behaves generally like the inferior or negative personality, parts of us that we wish we were not like. And the persona is a complicated system of relationships between individual consciousness and society. Professor Corbett's going to explain further, okay? It is designed on the one hand to produce a certain effect on others, and on the other hand to conceal the true nature of the individual. So you can see that it's in opposition to the shadow because it's developed for adaptation. So that the persona, that part of the personality developed and used in our interactions, okay, the persona, it would be our conscious outer face, for instance, or we could call it our social mask that we use to adapt to society. Jung gave the nome persona because of the masks in the ancient Greek theater that were called personas. So the face and role shown to others in our interaction, okay, with other people in our lives, and used to shape the outwardly visible image we have of ourselves, another way of thinking about the persona. So the way we feel, we have to behave. It would be the way we feel we have to behave. So the persona, of course, is collectively adequate, makes considerable concession to the outside world, forces the ego to identify with it, okay? Because the ego wants to adapt, to adjust. So the persona makes the ego to identify with it. So this leads certain people to believe that they are what they imagine themselves to be. But then the shadow, that it's in opposition. So talking about the shadow, the ego usually is not aware that it projects the shadow, okay, because it doesn't accept that content. So it would have qualities recognized as immoral or at least not recommendable, containing characteristics of a person's nature that are contrary to the customs and moral conventions of society. The shadow hides behind the persona. Parts of the shadow may be positive, though, such as undeveloped talents, for instance. But we are going to hear more with Professor Corbett. So every ego has a shadow. By adapting and coping with the world, whatever it cannot accomplish without facing a moral conflict will be accomplished by the shadow. This core of darkness, as Jung says, would be the very definition of human evil. Jung says that evil cannot be definitively eradicated. It constitutes an inevitable part of life. And then we have Edinger in his book Anatomy of the Psyche, when he says the development of the ego is associated with the experience of evil, crime, and guilt. Consciousness of the shadow makes individuation possible by uniting our ordinary human reality with the self. We're leaving all of these thoughts and reflections to Professor Corbett to comment on them, okay? So consciousness and the shadow, talking about, consciousness getting near the shadow. So there is a therapeutic need for the ego consciousness to confront its shadow. The two parties are transformed when this happens. One can observe the compensations on the part of the unconscious, which tend towards the establishment of a unity. After Professor Corbett talking about the shadow, the dark side of the self, I will bring to you a dream of a patient of mine. She authorized me to talk to you about this dream. And I think this kind of compensations, let's say, of the unconscious, of this effort that consciousness does when we are maturing, when we are doing the process that we're going to see later on, but we saw a little bit last class that Jung called individuation process, okay? So this need to, actually what we are doing here, self-discovery, right, Fabrizio? So the way that we try to get near our unconscious, to get to know more about ourselves, but not only on the surface, but also deep inside ourselves, because here we are using also Joanna de Angelis' knowledge, okay, that she brings through Divaldo. And this knowledge that we are spirits living in a material world, a material experience. And what does that mean in terms of our own psychology, our own process of learning, and our evolution, okay? So we struggle, as we have seen Joanna says, we need to be in contact with our potentialities, our spiritual forces, okay, deep within us, to struggle to learn whatever we came to learn in this life, okay? And this in the ego level would mean, at least is one of the things that I always think when I'm reading again Jung's concepts, and also reflecting and making connections with all the knowledge that Joanna brings. So one of the things is, first step is for the ego to confront its shadow, okay? And of course, it's not going to be easy, because the shadow is a shadow because it was once repressed or denied by the ego, okay? The ego tried to defend itself from this conscious contents. So what happens in this encounter? We would like to listen to Professor Corbett in some minutes, okay? And this step towards a more unite, if we could say, personality, or the unification. I don't think exactly is this, but to approximate conscious and the unconscious. And of course, as we've seen in the first images, the first complex probably that we face is the shadow, okay? So consciousness is renewed by plunging into the unconscious. Both consciousness and the unconscious constitute a barren land, as long as these two halves of psychic life are separated from each other. So this integration and growth that the light of consciousness, if we could say, can achieve by meeting the shadow and trying to integrate more the shadow. So the shadow is often not directly experienced by the ego. Being unconscious, it is then projected onto others. This rules out the possibility of using experience to gain conscious knowledge of our shadow features. However, if shadow traits become conscious and integrated, the person becomes very different from the average individual. Don't we need that? So everything ages and needs change and renewal. Thus, when the orientation and attitude of consciousness prove insufficient, like for instance, in times of crisis, and like these times when Spiritist knowledge say that we are living a more primitive world of suffering, okay, and going to regenerate world where we are going to be more spiritual individuals, okay, and a lot of other things will happen. So then, thus, when the orientation and attitude of consciousness prove insufficient, the process of psychic transformation begins. So we can think that we are in a process of psychic transformation. As Lionel Corbett says, when we were talking about last class, about the God image, right, Lionel? About all the changes that is happening in our God image. So the ego then has no choice but to confront its dark aspects repressed in the unconscious. And this is Jung saying in Mysterium Conunciones. It's volume 14 of the collected works. People, when educated to see clearly the dark side of their own nature, learn at the same time to understand and love their fellow men. A decrease in hypocrisy and an increase in self-knowledge can only result in greater consideration for others, as we are easily led to transfer the lack of respect and violence that we practice against our own nature onto our fellow human beings. So I think this is a great way that when Jung refers to this need to, be more compassionate with ourselves, because when the ego denies and represses contents coming from the unconscious and, let's say, create this shadow land inside of ourselves, we could think in terms of development that it's not being, as Jung says, we are doing a violence in a certain way to ourselves, okay? And we, as we saw, are going to project these contents onto others. And then, of course, it's one of the reasons that this lack of respect and violence, it's still, so much seen in our society. And then this is a sentence from the I Ching. It is only when we have the courage to face things as they are, without any self-deception or illusion, that a light of events will emerge by which we will recognize the path to success. And a sentence by Jung, I love this sentence: a person does not become enlightened simply by imagining figures of light, but by illuminating the darkness. So let me there's a case report, but I'm just going to stop sharing. And we are going to see Professor Corbett, and then we go back to the case report. Okay? Lana,
right. Thank you, Anahy. All right, so that was a very, very good summary. I'll just cover some of the main points about the shadow. First of all, every human being has a shadow. And the word is used in various ways. One meaning of the word, the commonest meaning, is to talk about negative parts of one's personality that you don't like, that are unacceptable to yourself. Things like envy or laziness or greed or any quality that you might be ashamed of is shadow material. And one way you know the shadow is that it emerges in certain situations. When people get drunk, for example, the shadow tends to emerge. Or when they become full of self-doubt, the shadow tends to emerge. The shadow can appear in dreams as usually a same-sex figure who's behaving very badly in a way that the conscious personality wouldn't like to behave. Another way that you can know, people often say, how can I know my shadow? Those are some of the ways. Another way that I suggest is just make a list of all the people you don't like. Make a list of the reasons you don't like them. And somewhere in there, you'll find your own shadow, because as Anahy said, we tend to project the shadow onto other people. So we don't like other people who embody aspects of our own shadow. The other way you can get to know your own shadow is ask somebody who knows you very well. If you have a partner or spouse or a very close friend, they usually know what your shadow is, even if you don't. Now, the other point, as we heard, is that the shadow can also be positive. For example, a person with very low self-esteem, very low self-worth, who's really a very good person, but can't feel their own goodness, then that goodness is part of the shadow. Or the person might have unconscious talents and abilities that they just don't realize that they have. Now, confrontation with one's shadow is painful, and as Jung says, is a moral problem, but it's crucial for self-knowledge and the expansion of consciousness. And Jung feels this should be one of the main tasks of psychotherapy. What very often emerges in psychotherapy is the projection of the shadow, assuming that other people have one's own negative qualities. This is sometimes called scapegoating. The mythology of the scapegoat, where you find someone, another person or another culture, another religion, to carry blame for some problem of your own or of your own culture. This scapegoat projection mechanism of the shadow is the mechanism that underlies a lot of racial prejudice and pogroms and so on, which allow another group to carry one's own shadow material. And you see it especially in wartime, where you get politicians will always talk about the enemy as depraved and evil and inhuman. They talk about the axis of evil or the evil empire. That kind of talk is always the projection of the shadow. You know, we're perfect, they're the bad guys. That's not acknowledging any shadow material. You see the shadow in literature quite a bit. If you look at the story of Jekyll and Hyde of Robert Louis Stevenson, it was written about 1880 something. The story is that Dr. Jekyll is a healing, kind-hearted doctor, and Mr. Hyde is a killer. And the doctor, the good doctor, has to struggle with his evil shadow. And the doctor has been struggling with this nasty shadow all his life. And in the story, he makes a potion to try to deal with his evil, but it actually transforms him into his evil side. And eventually he just becomes the shadow side, and that becomes more and more powerful. And that shows the difficulty of what we call integrating the shadow. In the end, the only way he can deal with his shadow side is to commit suicide. We also see the shadow in Scrooge's dream in the Charles Dickens Christmas Carol. The shadow appears as the ghost of Marley, who was one of Scrooge's partner. So that's an example of the shadow showing up in dreams. Now, I mentioned that integration of the shadow is very difficult, and sometimes it's impossible. An example would be, suppose somebody's shadow is rage and anger. If you could soften that and turn it into a kind of appropriate assertiveness, so that the assertiveness is contained and only manifests itself when really necessary, then that would be an example of the integration of the shadow. Or a person who's very vulnerable, where the shadow is low self-esteem and self-worth, that could possibly be integrated to become empathy for other people, kindness to other people. But sometimes the shadow is impossible to integrate. Sometimes you just have to endure it, just put up with it. When Neumann talks about this, he talks about coming to a gentleman's agreement with it. Sometimes you know it's there and you just have to live with it and try to control it and try not to project it. And then, as well as the individual shadow, there's also a cultural shadow, as we see in phenomena like the Nazi phenomena or racism. Those are cultural shadow phenomena. And then there's the archetypal shadow, which is known in mythology as the devil, the mythological devil, or the Antichrist. I'll come back to that in a minute, but I thought I might just say a little bit more about the persona. So, as Anahy said, the persona was the name given to the mask worn by classical Greco-Roman actors. And the mask had a hole at the mouth through which the sound came, per meaning through and sonar meaning sound. So the persona is the mask that you wear to cope with society. You have certain role expectations. If you're a teacher or a doctor or whatever it is, you're expected to behave in a certain way. All professions have those personas. So but you have to fulfill the way society wants you to behave. There are social demands. There's a cultural dimension to the persona. So the persona is a kind of compromise. The culture wants you to behave a certain way, and the ego or the personality wants to behave maybe differently. So you come up with some compromise that works for you. That's the persona. So it's adaptive, as Anahy said. It's a good adaptation. The problem with it is it obscures your individuality. If you identify very much with your persona, you end up with what's called a false self. It's not your real identity. So you have to have a persona to work in the world. But you must be able to drop it, when you're with family and friends. If you're, let's say you're a military drill sergeant and you're used to shouting at people and giving orders and so on, that's a certain persona. But if that person has to go home and live with his wife and children, he must drop that persona and behave like a normal human being. So the problem is that the persona is a problem if you can't let go of it, then you're using it defensively. The way you know what your persona is sometimes that you see it in dreams, especially if the dreams emphasize clothes. Clothes are how you present yourself. So clothes, pardon me, clothes often refer to the persona. Sorry, the other way you see the persona is, when you go into a doctor's office or a lawyer's office, you see all the diplomas hanging on the wall. I'm sorry. Or you see people wearing medals, those, status symbols. All that is just persona. You may have watched the recent coronation, all the regalia, that's all persona. Sorry. And that's why Jung says we are invested in the persona, because he says it's rewarded in cash. It's, you need it to earn your living. And it conceals the shadow. Your real nature, your shadow nature is hidden behind the mask, behind the persona. So as Anahy was pointing out, the shadow and the persona are an example of the tension of opposites within the personality, and the persona tries to compensate for the shadow. Now, there's a very important idea in Jung, which I think was one of the main points that Anahy wanted to get to, which is the notion of the dark side of the self, or the dark side of the God image. So Jung's idea is that there's an aspect of divinity which actually causes suffering and evil. And this contradicts and contravenes, say, traditional Christian doctrine, because in many traditions, especially in Christianity, people think of divinity as only good, benevolent, and loving, like the first letter of John says, he is only light, and in him there is no darkness at all. I think that's correct. So, but Jung would say that's not our experience. Sometimes terrible things happen. And some people think we can see the hand of God in the terrible things that happen. Think of the war in Ukraine, or the Holocaust, or, you know, the recent earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, those kind of terrible events. And the reason that Jung picked up on this idea was because of the biblical book of Job. Job in the story is an apparently innocent, pious man, and the God image in the story allows Job to suffer terribly. He loses all his 10 children, he loses all his possessions, he loses his health for no apparent reason. It's an archetypal story of the suffering of the innocents. Why does a perfectly innocent, pious, decent person suffer for no obvious reason? So Jung would say, well, when Job is suffering in this terrible way, he's experiencing the dark side of God, or the dark side of the God image, which causes suffering and evil. And this is actually common throughout the Hebrew Bible. There are many characters in the Hebrew Bible where divinity shows a kind of ruthlessness and causes a great deal of suffering, like destruction of cities and so on. So that's a kind of paradigm for the human experience of the dark side of God. So Jung thought that the old idea that we can think of God as the ultimate good and only good and loving just can't be maintained. If you try and do that, it's an act of denial. When you look at all the suffering and evil that's going on in the world, how can you maintain that God is only good? He felt that that was really denial. God is for Jung, God is a paradox that represents all the qualities of creation. Creation has positive and negative qualities in it. So he thinks that our image of God should contain all the opposites, good and evil, justice and injustice, and so on, because the self, or the God image, is the totality of the psyche, so it has to include all the opposites. Whereas in traditional Christianity, if you were to insist that, as some Christian theologians do, that God is only good, or Christ is only good, then you have to, excuse me, you have to split off evil and you project it either onto Satan or the Antichrist. It's a way of sort of evacuating any darkness from the God image. But our experience is that terrible things happen, and sometimes they seem to be more than human. Things like the Holocaust would be a good example. Of course, a lot of that kind of behavior is due to human evil and the misuse of free will. But Jung thinks that those atrocities are so big, there's something behind it as well as the human evil, the archetypal shadow that causes destruction and chaos and suffering and so on. So Jung very much objected to the classical idea in St. Augustine that evil is the absence of good. Augustine said that evil is it's not substantial in its own right. It's an absence of something which should be. It would be like a hole in a shirt. There's something missing that should be there. Jung really objected to that. He felt that evil is a positive thing. It's much more than just an absence. Now, we could argue about this because many people are very reluctant to give up the idea that God is only good. So this is something that we can discuss, if you like. And the problem is, if there is archetypal evil, a dark side to divinity, then how do we contain it or cope with it? This is a very old question, of course. I mean, the biblical book of Job, I think, was written about 400 BC. And this question keeps popping up. You know, we had the earthquake in Turkey and Syria recently, and in 1755 there was a Lisbon earthquake that killed tens of thousands of people. And so these things keep happening, and the Holocaust and these like that. And these force us to the realization that we might have to change our God image. because nobody can answer the question, where was God at Auschwitz? It cannot be answered. Well, Jung would say, well, that was the dark side of the self, the dark side of the God image. Now, this, if he's right, and this is debatable, then evil is more than purely human. The trouble with that is that it reduces our ability to understand evil, because this has important moral implications. Somebody could behave very badly. Imagine a mafia boss who says, well, I'm aligning with the dark side of God, you know, that would somehow legitimate evil. Well, that's really a big problem. Another problem is, if you look at scripture as a whole, could it be that there's some other aspects of scripture or some of the commandments in the Bible that were given by the dark side of God? It's a very tricky question. And the question leaves open whether God is completely righteous, completely just and fair, because the monotheistic traditions usually insist on that. But you have so many innocent people suffering that we could question God's total righteousness. But there's a lot of resistance to this, because it would mean a radical change in theology and so on. Jung thinks, for example, that the Christian notion of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, is incomplete. And he's not sure. He wants to add the feminine aspects of the divine, which some people think is there in the Holy Spirit. Some people think it was added when Mary, in the doctrine of the Assumption of Mary in 1950, which said that she was taken up to heaven and to form a kind of sacred marriage with God, what's called a hieros gamos. She becomes the goddess or the queen of heaven. So Jung thought that added a feminine element to the Trinity, or you could add the dark side of God to the Trinity. But he felt the Trinity as it is at the moment it was incomplete. That's another big debate. But the idea of the dark side of God is not a new idea. If you look at world mythology and world religion, there are many, many religions that have light and dark gods. You have Set and Osiris in Egyptian mythology, Loki and Baldur in Norse mythology, Ahriman and Ahura Mazda in Zoroastrianism. And as I said, in the Hebrew Bible, there are many instances of the dark side of God. Amos says, evil does not befall a city unless the Lord wills it. Proverb says, God has made all things for himself, even the wicked for the day of evil. And Isaiah says, I make peace and create evil. And so it's scattered through the Hebrew Bible, and we see all the warfare in the Hebrew Bible and the destruction by victorious armies. So it's not unknown to that tradition, but it's relatively repressed or not dealt with in the Christian tradition. It is a little bit by a few Christian theologians. But by and large, in Christian doctrine, evil is seen as a corruption of God's creation or the misuse of free will. It's not seen as the effect of God's power. So a lot of people think that Jung's notion of the dark side of God is incompatible with the Christian image of an all-good God. There is one place in the New Testament where you do see that, the dark side. It's in the book of Revelation with the avenging angels who are, plunging people into pits of fire and so on. But that's the only place I can think of at the moment where Christianity acknowledges that, I think. We have to acknowledge that there is not, in life, there is not always a resurrection following a crucifixion. People get crucified and there is no resurrection. Sometimes terrible things happen. So this is a frightening idea, this notion of divine darkness. And it may not have anything to do with the divine itself. It may be that this idea that the divine has these two sides to it may be just a human projection. One can't say, I think, one can't say anything about the divine nature itself. But I think Jung's point is that our experience of divinity is this both light and dark. So I think we have to be very humble here, but realize that people who are possessed by the dark side of the self, I'm thinking of people like Hitler or Putin, those kind of characters, can produce tremendous evil. They are identified with the self, I think you could say, in its dark aspect. They are malignant narcissists, inflated, arrogant people who, they in a way think that they are God, but the dark side of God. It's a very dangerous identification, and we see it in all demagogues historically, and unfortunately some contemporary demagogues who are malignant narcissists. And there are various explanations for why they feel so special and entitled. It may be a defense against vulnerability and shame, and so on, but that's a whole other sort of psychoanalytic story. But the point is that when they're grandiose and inflated, they commit horrendous evil. And what's happened is that these are people that allow the incarnation of the dark side of the self into the empirical personality. I don't know if this will make sense, but the human shadow, your own darkness, is partly human, partly the result of your own developmental factors, but partly it has a fragment of the archetypal shadow in it. And I think that the more people are abused and mistreated and neglected in childhood, forming complexes or areas of rage and hatred in them, which is true for all these malignant narcissists, the more open they are to the incarnation of the dark side of the self. That's one of the ways it gets into the human being, when the human being is abused or ill-treated. And the only thing that stands in the way of the archetypal shadow and our own shadow is our own moral sense. And if this idea is correct, it means that evil has an essence to it. It's not just an absence. And I think, as I say, the childhood environment determines whether the light side or the dark side of the archetype incarnates in us. If you have a childhood full of abuse and pain, evil is more likely to incarnate in the personality. People who've been badly abused in childhood become so angry and envious and destructive that they develop negatively toned complexes with a fragment of the dark side of the self at the core of it. And sometimes one of the things we can do in psychotherapy is ameliorate or even redeem a little bit of this material in psychotherapy. And maybe that has an effect on the dark side of the self. I don't know. That's a sort of metaphysical idea. The problem is that when you're experiencing the dark side of the self that's causing tremendous suffering, how do you relate to it? One way is to relate to it using spiritual practices of all the different kinds, by appeal to beliefs such as karma, or by finding meaning in suffering, or by realizing that this is a period of liminality. I don't know if you've talked about liminality, but it means that you're being initiated into a new level of consciousness. But the worst thing you can do is say, oh, I'm a divine victim, and not try to find any kind of meaning in it. One has to, I think, adopt sometimes an attitude of radical acceptance. You have to accept uncertainty, persevere in patience, because you know that you can't control or explain what's happening. That was what Job had to do in the story of Job. He had to be patient. We have this phrase in English, the patience of Job. And that requires radical acceptance and faith and sacrifice very often. If you're suffering from the dark side of the self, you have to decide to live in spite of the suffering that you're going through. You have to try to relate to the dark side of the self. And sometimes one has to surrender. Then you have to say, I'm going to live in harmony with my fate. This is my destiny, what's happening to me. And then the dark side of the self causing suffering is making you go in a direction that otherwise your life wouldn't go. But apparently the self thinks it's necessary, and we may have to consciously accept a difficult destiny. I realize this may contravene people's idea of free will, so I'd be happy to discuss this with you. Radical acceptance doesn't mean that you don't take responsibility, and you do take necessary action when these painful things happen to you. But the action arises from acceptance, that from the realization that there's a background intelligent order which is affecting your life, rather than acting out of anger or bitterness. You may be able to, what Job did is he transformed the violence of the self that was being inflicted on him by making it conscious, by becoming conscious of it, and by making the self conscious. Jung's idea was that the self didn't realize the suffering that it was causing Job, and only when Job maintained his integrity and his position did the self have to become conscious of its own shadow. So this is an example of a kind of reciprocal relationship, according to Jung, between humanity and divinity, where Jung thinks that we offer the divine a kind of reflecting consciousness, so that it can become conscious of some of the material contained within it that otherwise it's not aware of. I can say more about that, but I think I've talked enough, so maybe that would do for the time being. Okay.
Maybe I can show the dream first, Sylvia. Okay, I think it would be better to show the dream.
Okay.
Let me just share the screen again. Okay. So we are back to the PowerPoint. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
We're good. Yeah.
Okay. But it's not, let me just, okay. So it's a middle-aged plastic surgeon who is in a professional transition phase, opening her own surgical clinic, and has the following dream. She's in a house which is not hers, with other people. In the room of the house where they are, suddenly a wall appears and it makes them exit to another room, searching for a way out. This process is repeated many times. She says that the idea is that of a labyrinth, until they reach a kind of garden. The feeling is one of anxiety. When she talks about this, she remembers the movie Hunger Games. And she goes towards the wall. There is a wall which looks medieval, trying to escape, but there are no openings in it. At this moment, she sees that in another part of the garden, there are some doors, and that people are having to choose which door to go through. In addition, near the doors, she sees shadowy figures that scare her, especially one that she describes as a man with a demonic appearance, with something like horns on his head. Even so, she approaches, sees that people are putting on some accessories, like a waistband, and something on their feet. It reminds her of the ritual of dressing for surgeries. And thus, and she does the same. When she chooses a door, she begins to feel her heart beating faster as she approaches the shadowy figure. However, when she looks at him, she sees that his eyes show kindness, and her heart returns to normal. At this point, when her heart returns to normal, he says she can pass. On the other side, people are naked, taking showers. She does the same, and then she goes on to an open space where there is a paradisiacal landscape, and feelings of peace and happiness take her over. Then the dream ends. There is one thing that I forgot to put, Lionel, in the dream, is that when she and everybody, when she goes to the showers, when she passes through the door and see everybody's naked taking showers, and she doesn't see herself, but she knows she is in the same thing, taking a shower. She looks up and there is a man defecating in the shower, and she knows that it's because of his fear. His fears are going away. Okay, I think this is important. I forgot to put. And she goes through, she doesn't defecate, but she looks at this man. And then she takes the shower, and then she goes to this open space. There's like paradise, and the feeling overwhelms her. Okay. And then I just put in the PowerPoint our Black Madonna that we talked about, and Lionel said, "Oh, the dark side of the Great Mother." And I said, well, we could think that, but we could think also that it would be illuminating the matter as we were talking. Okay, I'll just stop sharing, and maybe Lionel, you could comment a little bit about the dream.
Yeah, could you put it up again so I can go through it? Would that be okay? Do you mind?
Yeah, I'll just have to go again. The PowerPoint?
Yeah, no, just the beginning of the dream, just a few slides back.
The beginning of the dream, okay. So.
Yeah, just go a couple of slides back.
Okay, plastic surgery. Oh, I think saying her specialty.
Okay, so this, sorry, what did you say?
That I put that she's a plastic surgeon because she likes everything beautiful. And she's very connected to the persona, especially, you talked about the professional, but also especially because when she has to advertise the clinic, the surgical clinic. So she has to be, you know, very okay with her persona and beautiful and this and that. And she has other colleagues that she called, you know, for the clinic. And she started getting upset with things that happen when you have to put a thing like so big as a surgical clinic, and all the kinds of people that go, and she has patients that go for, of course, for plastic surgery, but there are other specialties in the clinic also. Okay, she's the owner of the clinic, but she called other colleagues from other specialties, and she's getting in conflict with you know, the way that she likes everything beautiful and harmonic, and the way that she has to deal with, of course, we are talking about your own shadow when you get upset, when you scream at your secretary or something like that, and you want to be nice and you want everything to be beautiful, things like that. Excuse me, you are going to ask me something?
No, I was going to say that the important point is that the dream is commenting on the transition. It's talking about, it's a what I said is referred to as a liminal period, a period of transition. Okay, So that's this is the comment of the unconscious on her situation. And it begins that she's in a house, and in a dream, a house or any structure in a dream always represents a structure in the personality, meaning a set of attitudes and beliefs or a situation that lasts a long time. It's like a house. It takes time to build, and then it stays quite a long time. So this is a psychological structure that's going on in her. And you see how the wall appears that makes them go into another room. So it's like when we say someone has run into a brick wall, it's talking about the fact that she must have hit a barrier that's making her, but there's another way. She gets an exit to another another room. And was the association, her association to the labyrinth? That's very important, because the labyrinth is often associated with the search for paradise in world mythology, or the search for the Holy Grail, or the search for the hidden center. It's often an image of the search for something very special, but you have to go through it to find it, you have to go through a very complicated system. Could you go to the next one?
It's her association, yeah.
Yeah, and she's anxious. So this, I think, represents the difficulty that she's going through with trying to find this way is blocked and finding another way and so on. I don't know what the medieval quality of the wall is. I'd have to ask her, what was the wall that was blocking your way? We'd have to get her associations to that.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously there's several choices that she has that represents the doors. But could you go to the next one, please?
To the next?
The next one, yeah. But then the shadow figure appears, a man with a demonic appearance with something like horns on his head. I mean, it's an old Christian notion that the devil has horns on its head. It's often, in the liturgy and in the sacred art, the devil is often appears with horns. So she's come across something. You could say she's come across some demonic part of herself, or you could say that this is a kind of archetypal element which is in her psyche that she experiences as demonic. But then it transforms into something positive, doesn't it? So can you go to the next? They're putting on these accessories. Can you do them?
It's like a belt,
Yeah.
This waistband, like a belt that she had to put on. So there's all the symbolism of the belt, right? And it reminds her at this point. It reminds her of this ritual that we have to go when we go to a surgery, make a surgery, wash hands and put something in your head, in your feet, and dress up with white and all this stuff. And this is the next one, Lionel.
Yeah, okay. So when she approaches the shadow figure, he's actually kind and she calms down. So in other words, that you'd have to try to find out what it is in her that she experiences as demonic or devilish, but which when she approaches it is actually good to her. But I don't know what that would be because I don't know her. So I'd have to talk to her about what's the demonic thing in you. That kind of
actually I brought this so that people could have an idea, because of course there is the shadow aspects, And
Yeah.
one of them, I can tell you, she has had a really big fight discussion, you know, because she got really mad, really angry at the secretary that made a mistake and exposed her in a way, okay? And of course, she got really upset because the secretary had been working for her many years previously before going to the clinic, and they were kind of friends actually.
Yeah.
But this anger, it's part of her from the past that she felt towards her father. And
So
that's why I think
shadow is anger. Yeah.
yeah, it's anger.
Yeah.
So, but she is in analysis, so she is in contact with this anger, and she could express this previously.
Yeah.
So I think this she talked about a lot about feeling the heartbeat and being afraid to confront this shadowy figure. But then when she looked in the eyes, you know, the windows to the soul, let's say, she saw kindness. We are working on that duality, you know, that if we feel like you were saying, Lionel, when because she has been as a children, okay, it's not that she was abused, but she was neglected. It's a kind of abuse, okay, very neglected by the, you know, a very poor family and things like that. She had always to take care of others, and there was no one to take care of her, actually, in a sense, to understand what she was feeling, what she was going on. And the father had left her, you know, and denied her existence and things like that. So the anger has been worked through the analysis. But I think that this was, and it was only last Wednesday, and she allowed me to share with you. So I think it's very important because it's an example of this integration of the shadow, because we get scared with our, you know, shadowy contents.
Right.
For instance, feeling very angry and hurting people that you love, being able to hurt people that you love. And this can happen to any of us, right? But
Right,
if you don't look in...
Yeah, when she looks at him, that's when the transformation occurs. So it's become, that means she becomes conscious of him.
Yeah, she talked a lot. This was made a really impact on her, to look in the eyes and feel the heartbeat slowing down. Yeah. And when it was totally normal again, she says, because as a medical doctor, she's always very taking care of these signs, of course, when she goes in a surgery and things like that. So when she feels that it slows down, then the figure, the shadowy figure, that it's felt as good in this moment, okay, then he says you can pass. And I thought it was very meaningful. I forgot, because I was worried with the space of the slide, okay, and I forgot to put, but it made an impact also when she was in the shower, and you told everybody, of course, that the clothes are the persona, right? And everybody was naked taking showers, okay, like getting rid of this stuff. And then she saw this man defecating, and she understood in that moment that it was his fears that were going away. So I think the fear, when of course it's also a part of something that it's denied by her, to have fear. She has to be very strong. Medical doctors, especially surgeons, right? If you go there and you have to open a person, you have to be very strong. You cannot have fear in that moment.
Yeah, we'll have a phrase in English, shit scared. Do you have that in Portuguese?
Yes, kind of. Yes, kind of.
Portuguese, yeah. And the nakedness that you say is the lack of persona. That's it's, yeah, it's very interesting how it deals. She gets rid of the persona, and then she discovers paradise. I mean, such an archetypal dream. I would tell her that she's going to be okay.
Yeah,
I think
we are just, it's just the first time that she brought the dream. It's just last week.
Yeah.
But I think I thought it was very, it was a synchronicity and very important for everybody to see in practice. Okay,
Yeah.
because otherwise it's a lot of concepts and maybe they don't connect. But can I stop sharing? Yeah.
Maybe there's some comments from the group.
Yeah, let's hear everybody.
I think we have a question for Sylvia. Sylvia, did you have your hands up?
No, I had a question about something that Lionel had said about God, but I open my, anybody can make the comment now, otherwise it will be a different thing. So you can comment on the dream that, is more important at the moment. Thank you.
Well, I think if people are thinking about, and Sylvia, we are going to be talking, and this is part one, okay? Because I wanted very much for you guys to listen to Professor Corbett, and we are going to go on next class talking about then Joanna's thoughts about the shadow, okay? I think Kai wants to say something. Kai.
Yes, and it's about the dream, but also about what Lionel said, the dark image of God. Dreams are images, right? Like when we think about God, when we think about the image of God, there is some projections, right? The image is something that we project. So when we are projecting the dark side of God, maybe it's coming from our shadows, like when we have the dreams and we project our mental house into the dreams. So what we are talking about is not, in my understanding, is not about God, but how we see God. Is that right, Lionel?
Yeah. One of the criticisms of Jung was that he was projecting his own shadow material onto his notion of the dark side of God, for just the reasons that you said. And you're right that these are images, which means we have a concept, and the concept has to be based on the way these things appear in dreams, like this dream we just heard, where you get these demonic figures. Is that kind of demonic figure something in the dreamer, a part of her which is demonic, or is it really an archetypal image showing her that that wouldn't be if it's something that comes from the self, it wouldn't be a projection. If it's just her own shadow material, I agree, it's a projection. But sometimes you get imagery in dreams that just are archetypal figures that are not projections. They are aspects of the self in a symbolic form. So they're not always projections.
One more thing.
Go ahead, Kai.
That I would like to add is when we talk about suffering and all the darkness in the world, if we don't talk about past lives and reincarnation, it's hard to understand. But maybe with that knowledge, things become much more clear.
Well, we have an explanation. If you believe in past lives and karma, you have a sort of a partial explanation. You can say, this is my karma. And sometimes that's helpful, I think. But of course, many people don't accept that. It depends whether you believe that. I think this group probably would accept it.
And just one more thing.
Okay.
hypnotherapy, maybe we can work through our shadows. I agree with Lionel when he says that sometimes it's hard, and then we just accept the shadow and try to deal with it. But I believe that knowing about before into our complex that maybe we bring to this lifetime, we are able to connect dots and then maybe integrate some of the stuff that we carry with us. That's just a comment.
Yeah. Anahy, how long have you been seeing this woman?
I think it's about 2 years, more or less, a little.
Because another possibility is that the dream is talking about the transference relationship with you.
Yeah, it could be. Of course, there are many levels, right?
Yeah.
Of,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't like to. So go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I said not that you're a demonic figure, but
yeah, I know that. But I wouldn't like to go into specifics because, you know, I think it would. It's not like a technical thing, but it's only for people to have an example of in real life, because there are lots of different levels that we work with the dreams with the person. And of course, we are in the beginning of this work because she just brought the dream. I'm going to give to Sylvia, but before that, and then Sylvia can see if she's going to ask kind of the same thing. But I asked Lionel previously to our meeting, so I would like to see his opinions. And I think there is something also in what Kai brought, that about the shadow. Then bring the Joanna's. So if we think like Joanna brings, okay, the idea that Jung's self is our spirit, as Joanna says, okay, and that we reincarnate to learn and evolve, then could we think that the self is aware of his dark side, even if the ego is not aware of its shadow? That's one question that I made Lionel. I would like him to comment on, because then it's not Jung exactly, because here then we are talking about reincarnation and about this notion that the self would be our spirit. And according to Spiritist knowledge, okay, we reincarnate to learn and evolve. So even our mistakes, even the evil things that we do would be not the absence of good, of like privatio bene, right? Not the absence of the good. That's what the spirits tell Allan Kardec. So I would like you to comment a little bit. So because if Joanna says that our spirit is the self, is Jung's self, is the same thing, then it agrees with what Kai is saying, that and what we wondered, we talked a little bit the previous meeting, that it's not, we are not talking about the God, the transcendent, the, you know, that is beyond our comprehension, but we are talking, as Kai was saying, about our perceptions, our idea, even if it's ourself, because ourselves with capital S as the spirit, and our spirit is ignorant of many things. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here learning and having this experience in the material world and in duality. So, of course, the self, being the spirit, could have much more knowledge of its own darkness than the ego. I don't know, just for you to comment, and then we give to Sylvia.
I think this is an area that Jung made a mistake in. Jung, of course, the self and is the spirit, obviously. Jung thought that the self was partly unconscious of its own dark side, so that in the Bible, God didn't realize what the suffering that he was making Job go through, because he was unconscious of his own dark side. I think that's a mistake. I think the self is the totality of consciousness, so it cannot be unconscious. Of course, it's completely conscious of everything in it. I think Jung just made a mistake there. So I would say it's aware of everything. There is the self can't be unconscious. It is consciousness. Okay, so that's my opinion. You know, Jung didn't get everything right.
Yeah, thank you, Lionel. Sylvia, you would like to ask something? And Andres too.
Okay, very briefly. Going back to, but with the explanation that Lionel just gave, sort of explains a little more, was when you were talking about the Jung, for Jung, God was a paradox that contained good and evil. And it sort of reminded me a bit of, you know, the Gita, when you talk about Shiva, that she is the god of creation, but she also is the destroyer. Yeah. So in a way, they have both. But I think the perspective that we have as Christians is quite different in relation to God. But I think that, and in many ways, I think when we say something happened and was very tragic, many times people who are very religious, and I think happens mostly to them, they will always say, God is doing this to me. I'm not going to believe in God anymore. I think it's a kind of almost like a reaction that people will not accept God because God is doing it to me. Whereas while we're growing, we have good things and bad things. And I just wondered if that maybe would, you know, in seeing the destroyer and the creator together would be a different concept, not as, because what you said now that, you know, Jung was wrong and that the self is a totality of consciousness, and by its very nature, it needs to be conscious and aware and everything. If that, you know, this thing that fights one against the other, which we as human beings are constantly, you know, like Anahy said, we are here to learn and to progress, but also suffering is a very great part of the learning, isn't it? So how do we see that? Is this destroyer and creator is part of it? It's like being shaped, like a diamond being shaped by the forces that we bring the shine and the light within. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah,
Am I in the wrong way thinking, or was too confusing?
That tradition is another example of the idea that the divine has a light side and a dark side. I mentioned several other traditions, but you're right that they have creation, preservation, and destruction as part of divinity. So that's just another example of that. It's only Christianity that wants to hang on to an only good God image, I think. Yeah. So I agree with you about that. If suffering, when you suffer, you can either take the position that you're a divine victim and nothing you can do about it, or you can try to find the meaning in it and try to find where the suffering is taking you. You know, what are you being initiated into a new level of consciousness? Is there some meaning that this has, you know, rather than just thinking it's purposeless?
Yes, because it just occurred to me, like if you know, in John's of the Cross, the Dark Night of the Soul, when he talks about that, but also, you know, Viktor Frankl, in his book, he talks about his experience in Auschwitz, being in a concentration camp, and the way you have to find meaning to something is the way to survive. In many ways, they seem to almost be parallel the conclusion that they come, finding meaning in suffering, to survive and to overcome. And
Jung and Frankl have that in common. They both emphasize meaning, I think. Frankl, Frankl is an existentialist. He thinks that you can choose your attitude to the situation that you're in. I'm not sure that that's true, actually. It raises the whole question of free will, but anyway, you're right that they have the same attitude.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Andres, I think Andres wants to. Microphone.
Just a question to the demon, or the demon with horns in a dream which scares us. Isn't it a way of keeping us in check of our own shadow? Isn't it something like a mirror? Isn't it something, if you really truly look, it's not what it really truly is? I think what scares us the most about it is ourselves. And if you stay long enough with it, it turns into something totally different. It keeps us from going astray. It keeps us not going that direction. So it's a little bit like, don't come off your path. I don't see demons as a negative or as a evil influence within the dream. It just wants you to see yourself more clearly. And I think it's more to do with trust. What do you think about that?
What's the connection to trust exactly?
Say that again. Sorry.
When she first sees it, when she first sees this figure, she's very afraid of it.
Yes.
And then when she looks at it, it becomes benign or benevolent. So that's the teaching, that she has to look at her shadow. But I didn't get a connection to trust. What was the connection to trust?
Trust with that. It's a bit like it's not a negative. It's not something which causes harm. Something we don't have to run away from. So we usually try to get away, and I think by trying to get away, it will chase, and it chases only because it has a message. And I think the message is clearly coming from us, from within us, and it's just mirrors.
But it takes a lot of courage to confront.
Yes, absolutely. In everyday life, the same, isn't it? Yeah.
That's why it's important, I think.
So go ahead, Lana.
It's important because when you are suffering and you say to yourself, this is the dark side of the self, what Job said is, I know that my Redeemer lives. He knew that even though he was suffering, that there was some background intelligence going on behind the scenes. If you can say that, then that requires faith, actually. Otherwise, life is a tale told by an idiot, and suffering is just random and has no meaning. So.
I would like to, I know we have like 5 minutes, but I would like, since we were talking about the dark side of the God image and this and that, so I brought to you 3 questions of the Spirit's book, okay? And I think it's very important because a lot of people don't have any idea what's written or haven't read yet. So the Spirit's book by Allan Kardec, and we all know that he made, he used what we call nowadays the scientific method, because he would send a lot of mediums all over Europe a question. And the first question, and then he would receive the answers and go through the answers, okay, with reasoning and doing like statistical learning of the thing, okay, studying of the questions, the answers. So the first one is first book, Primary Causes. I translated very quickly, but the Spirit's book is already translated to English, so anyone can go and find. So what is God? The first question of the Spirit's book. God is the supreme intelligence, primary cause, Lionel, of everything, then from this point of view, Jung wouldn't be so wrong. And the first, because it's a lot of questions, okay, so we should go through all of it. But I just wanted to give you some small, so, and I didn't translate all of them, but then only three, then he goes on about the infinity and all of that. So God is the supreme intelligence, primary cause of everything. Then when he asks about attributes of divinity, then he is asking the spirits, if we cannot comprehend the intimate nature of God, because the spirits had told him in another question, can we at least have an idea about some of its perfections? And then the spirits say, yes, about some. The human being understands himself, herself better as she rises above matter. Then she will see them through thought when we rise above matter. And then he says, when we say that God is eternal, infinite, immutable, immaterial, unique, all-powerful, all good and fair, don't we have a complete idea about God's attributes? And we were talking about that. And the spirits say, from your point of view, yes, because you believe you are encompassing everything. But know this, there are things far above the understanding of the most intelligent human being. And for these things, your language, your limited language, developed by your ideas and sensations, does not have expressions. This is the 19th century, okay? So, but I think it's very important to pay attention to the answers. Your reason says that God must have these perfections in the highest level there is, because if one of them didn't exist or its level was not infinite, it would not be superior to everything. So it could not be God. And it goes on, but I think it's very important because when we talk about the Spirit's book and what I told you before, so that the spirits are actually telling us that we don't have intelligence enough to understand the head office, as you say, Lana. So not even Jung was so intelligent to understand. So we have to rise above matter. For me, it means we have to get to a point of non-duality. And while we are in this dual thing, light and shadow, good and evil, we are still thinking in a dual way. So of course, when they say that, and you talked about liminality, and I wanted to bring very much this dream because of this transitional phase that we have to face our own shadows. We are going to leave this in the transference, as you said. There's a lot of put in the WhatsApp group, Black Madonnas, because of course what is within is outside, and what's outside is within, as Jung says. So one of our questions, for instance, as a mother, in today's Mother's Day in Brazil, and I think in the US, I'm not sure in England, but anyway, no, and yeah, so I thought it's a lot of synchronicity, because when you and we as therapists, analysts, whatever, people, medical people taking care of people, and many other professions, and even studying spiritualist content, we feel very upset with all the suffering that is going on. So of course, sometimes we get mad at the, even the Great Mother. How come you're going to throw all this fire on us? Okay, and it's okay to be mad, because it's our ego. Like in the transference, of course, if the analyst says something that the person feels it's going, touching some soft spots, I think we say like this in English, right? And then of course it's going to be felt as, I'm not, I will suffer or I will be rejected, especially in a person that has been rejected, so felt rejected so many times. But we have to light this, show this, and we have to get in contact, as Andrea is saying, trying to, to have courage to face our own shadows. And the other part, as I was kind of joking with Lionel, we're making a little fun, that we can see the anger in Mother Earth, but we can see, like Sylvia is saying, transformation, rebirth, right? And we can see the spirit in the matter, in the black matter, for instance. We can see the love, the compassion that suffers, as Lionel was saying, that Dios tries to find the meaning in suffering, as the Great Mother does, right? Lionel was talking about Christianity, but it's a beautiful image of the light side of the mother when we respect the suffering of our children, because they have to go through and they have to, to fulfill their mission. So respecting, even if it causes us a lot of pain. So this love and light that can, or this love and compassion that can light the matter. I think it's very beautiful image. But of course, we are still in a duality, ego and self, and the spirit having a material experience. But if we learn, I do believe that if we learn everything that we have to learn, then we are not going to be ignorant, and we can rise above matter, and then we can reach a stage of non-duality where everything is connected. I don't know, Lionel knows me, I like to be positive always, but and that's why I think Joanna is bringing us, never forgetting Joanna is a lady. We are going to be talking in the last class about a lot of her past reincarnations. Lionel, would you like to comment? Because I think we are in the end.
Comment on which of the things?
Whatever you want to say to people.
Well, Karnak may have read the Upanishads. In the Upanishads, they have a Nirguna Brahman, the divine that's completely transcendent beyond any attribute, and Saguna Brahman, the divine with attributes, where we get all these ideas about God. So that's the same idea, really, just two levels of divinity. I don't know what else to. Non-duality is the ultimate medicine. There's no doubt that we've been talking dualistically, but that's a whole discussion in its own right. I mean, that's a big subject. Anyway, the difficulty is you can't get there from here.
Spiritist knowledge disagree with you, but we are going to be talking about that later on. I think Andreas wants to say something.
Sorry, Anahy, very quickly. But when we
I
talk
always say to finish off, it's like, we tell God our plans, we share it with him, and he has a laugh on our expense. Yes. So he changes it that moment. And you think you have got it all, and you have it all in your hands, and you live this beautiful, peaceful life after many, many years, and then God throws a spanner in your way and turns it all upside down, and they say, what, really? Do you really think you can sit on the beach or walk in a park for the rest of your life? No, let's spice it up a little bit more. And illumination happens many times in this lifetime, I have to truly say, because illumination is the ultimate to enlightenment, isn't it? And yes, pain, struggle, it's the only way to illuminate. So
it's not.
That's but it's one of the ways, okay. Yeah. A most powerful one. You know, you don't think you could become a better person because you don't think you're a bad one. Then all of a sudden, when you struggle and you go through something, saying like, that was actually a really good trip on the end, you know.
Thank you, Andres. I think only Sylvia wants to say something, and then we
something
can
very, very briefly, giving what you were saying about suffering and everything. I think one of the facts that sometimes we get angry at seeing suffering is because we have achieved already a level that we have empathy with suffering. It doesn't help us. It makes us feel unhappy to see other people suffer. I think because somehow we've already reached a certain level of enlightenment or something, that the suffering of others makes us suffer as well. I think Emmanuel had something which he says, the suffering of others. He writes about that. And I think because we've already reached a certain level of empathy, that's how I feel anyway. Thank you,
Sylvia. And I want to thank you very much, Professor Corbett, for being here with us today. It's a great opportunity always when he can. And of course, we are going to be expecting you next time you are able, Lionel, okay? Yeah. And thank you all. And as we agreed, if there are any doubts that people have or remember, just send to Fabrizio, right, Fabrizio?
Yeah.
And he will send to us and we can discuss in the next class, okay? Thank you so much. Thank you, Lionel. Bye-bye.